I was misled, I was deceived, but now I know the truth. Jesus saved me.
Today's testimony was shared with us by a brother from Gaza, Omar, a 30-year-old Palestinian whose heart was transformed through a fierce spiritual struggle. Raised in conflict and driven by hatred after personal loss, Omar fought as a jihadist until his capture in 2017. In an Israeli prison, unexpected kindness sparked a crisis of faith, leading him to question everything and ultimately find peace in Jesus Christ. His journey from vengeance to redemption is a powerful testament to God's grace overcoming the deepest struggles. And here is his story. My name is Omar, and I was born into a world where hatred was taught before love, where violence was praised more than peace, and where dying for a cause was considered more honorable than living for hope. This is my story, a story of how God's love reached into the darkest corners of human hatred and transformed a heart that I thought was beyond saving. I came into this world on March 15, 1995, in Gaza City during what the adults called difficult times. Looking back now, I realize there were never any easy times in Gaza, just varying degrees of difficulty, conflict, and loss. My earliest memories are of the sound of helicopters overhead, the smell of smoke drifting through our neighborhood, and the worried conversations of adults who stopped talking when children entered the room. My father, Mahmoud, was a man of strong convictions and fierce pride. He worked as a mechanic during the day, but his real passion was his involvement with local resistance groups. He never spoke directly about his activities, even to my mother, but I knew from the hushed phone calls, the late-night meetings in our small living room, and the way certain men treated him with special respect that he was involved in something he considered sacred and dangerous. He would tell me that a man must stand for something, that we had been wronged, and that it was our religious duty to fight for justice. Even as a small child, I understood that justice meant fighting against Israel, though I couldn't have articulated why this fighting was necessary or what it was supposed to accomplish. It was simply the reality I was born into, as natural and unquestioned as breathing. My mother, Fatima, was a gentle woman who tried to shield me and my younger sister, Layla, from the harshest realities of our situation. She would sing to us during the nights when explosions echoed across the city, hold us close when the power went out for days at a time, and somehow manage to find reasons to smile even when food was scarce and hope seemed scarcer. But even my mother carried the same fundamental beliefs that shaped our community. She taught me to recite verses from the Quran about fighting in Allah's cause, to pray for the destruction of our enemies, and to believe that martyrdom in jihad was the highest honor a Muslim could achieve. She would whisper to me at bedtime that Allah loved those who fought for His cause, and that paradise awaited those who sacrificed for the faith. These weren't unusual teachings in our community. Every family shared similar beliefs, every mosque preached similar messages, every child grew up understanding that we were engaged in a holy war that had been ordained by God Himself. The schools I attended reinforced these lessons. We learned mathematics using word problems about rockets and casualties. We studied geography by memorizing the boundaries of historical Palestine and discussing the injustice of current borders. We practiced writing by composing essays about resistance heroes and the glory of martyrdom. But it wasn't just formal education that shaped my worldview. The real lessons came from daily life. From seeing my father's friends disappear for weeks at a time and return with stories they couldn't tell. From watching my mother cry over neighbors who didn't come home. From experiencing the regular cycles of conflict that punctuated our existence like seasons. I was 8 years old during the 2003 escalation of violence. I remember hiding in our small bathroom with my family while explosions shook our building, listening to my father explain that our enemies hated us because we were Muslim, because we worshipped Allah and followed the true path. My mother would add that Allah tested the faithful, allowing the righteous to suffer so that their faith could be proven and their reward in paradise increased. These explanations satisfied me at the time because they came from people I loved and trusted, and because they provided a framework for understanding the chaos and pain that surrounded us. We weren't just victims of random violence. We were soldiers in a cosmic battle between good and evil, faithful servants of Allah fighting against the enemies of Islam. As I grew older, this understanding deepened and became more sophisticated. I learned about Islamic history, about the early conquests and the glory days when Muslim armies spread the true faith across the world. I learned about the Crusades and how Christians had invaded Muslim lands with cross and sword. I learned about colonialism and how Western powers had carved up the Middle East for their own benefit. But most importantly, I learned about Palestine, about how our land had been stolen, our people displaced, our holy sites desecrated. I learned that the conflict wasn't just political but religious, that the Jews and Christians who supported Israel weren't just occupying our territory but attacking Islam itself. By the time I was 13, I could recite the entire narrative by heart. We were the indigenous people of this land, blessed by Allah and chosen to guard the holy sites. The Jews were interlopers, supported by Christian crusaders, who had used deception and violence to steal what belonged to us. Our resistance wasn't terrorism but jihad, holy war commanded by Allah Himself. And I believed every word of it with the passionate certainty that only a teenager can possess. The event that transformed my understanding from academic knowledge to personal mission happened on December 27, 2008. I will never forget that date, because it was the day my father died and the day I truly became a fighter. The operation that killed him was supposed to be routine, a supply run to deliver materials to fighters in a different sector of Gaza. My father had made similar trips dozens of times before, but this time intelligence had leaked, or luck had run out, or Allah had decided it was time for my father to receive his reward in paradise. The missile strike happened at 2:47 in the afternoon. I know the exact time because I had been watching the clock in our kitchen, waiting for my father to return home so we could go to the mosque together for afternoon prayers. The explosion was so close that it shook dishes off our shelves and cracked a window in our living room. My mother knew immediately what had happened. I think mothers always know. She began keening, that ancient sound of grief that women make when their men don't come home, before anyone had told us anything official. The men who came to inform us were respectful and formal. They used the traditional phrases about Allah's will and martyrdom and sacrifice not being in vain. But their words couldn't touch the raw hole that had been torn in my chest. The sudden understanding that my father would never walk through our door again, never pray beside me again, never teach me anything again. The funeral was a community celebration of martyrdom. Hundreds of people came to honor my father's sacrifice for the cause. Speakers praised his dedication to jihad, his willingness to die for Allah, his assured place in paradise among the righteous dead. But I wasn't comforted by their words. I was enraged by them. My father was dead. Not metaphorically, not temporarily, actually permanently, irreversibly dead. And the people who had killed him were still alive, still occupying our land, still planning to kill more fathers and sons and brothers. That night, alone in my room, I made a promise to Allah and to my father's memory. I would take up the fight where he had left off. I would dedicate my life to jihad, to the holy war that had claimed his life. I would train, I would fight, I would kill the enemies of Islam, and if necessary, I would die as a martyr just as he had died. I was 13 years old, and I had just committed my life to hatred and violence in the name of God. The transformation from grieving son to dedicated fighter didn't happen overnight, but it happened quickly. Within weeks of my father's funeral, I had made contact with some of his former associates. They were initially reluctant to involve someone so young, but my passion and my connection to a respected martyr eventually convinced them to begin my training. The early stages were mostly ideological, hours of discussion about Islamic theology, Palestinian history, and the religious duty of jihad. I learned verses from the Quran that justified violence against enemies of Islam. I studied the lives of the Prophet Muhammad's companions who had died in battle. I memorized the promises of paradise that awaited those who sacrificed their lives for Allah's cause. Sheikh Hassan, the religious leader who oversaw my education, would explain that jihad wasn't just permitted, but commanded. When enemies of Islam occupied Muslim land, when they killed Muslim people, when they threatened the faith itself, then jihad became an individual obligation for every Muslim man. Anyone who supported the occupation was guilty. Anyone who served in their army was guilty. Anyone who lived on stolen Palestinian land was guilty. The logic seemed airtight to my teenage mind. We weren't random killers or terrorists. We were soldiers of Allah, fighting a defensive war against invaders and oppressors. Every action we took was sanctified by religious duty and justified by enemy aggression. Physical training began when I turned 14. It started with basic fitness, running, climbing, building the strength and endurance that a fighter would need. Then came weapons training, learning to maintain and fire various types of small arms, understanding explosives and their applications, mastering the tactical skills needed for urban warfare. But the most important part of my training was psychological, learning to overcome the natural human reluctance to kill, developing the mindset that could justify taking lives in Allah's name. Abu Khalil, my military trainer, would remind us constantly that this wasn't murder, but warfare. When we killed enemy soldiers, we weren't committing sins, but performing sacred duties that Allah would reward. These teachings were reinforced through constant repetition, group discussion, and exposure to propaganda that portrayed our enemies as less than human. I watched videos of Israeli soldiers mistreating Palestinian civilians, read accounts of atrocities committed against Muslim populations around the world, absorbed story after story that reinforced the narrative of Islamic victimhood and justified violent response. By the time I was 16, I had become a true believer in the most dangerous sense. I didn't just intellectually accept the necessity of jihad. I felt it in my bones, dreamed about it at night, lived for the opportunity to prove my dedication to Allah through violence against His enemies. My first operational mission came in July 2012, just after my 17th birthday. It was a relatively simple assignment, serving as a lookout during an attack on an Israeli patrol near the border. My job was to watch for reinforcements and signal if the situation became dangerous for our primary fighters. I remember the mixture of excitement and terror I felt as I crouched in my assigned position, watching the road through binoculars while my older comrades prepared their ambush. This was it, my chance to participate directly in jihad, to honor my father's memory, to serve Allah's cause with my own hands. When the attack began, the sound of gunfire was deafening. I watched through my binoculars as our fighters engaged the Israeli patrol, seeing muzzle flashes and smoke, hearing shouts in Hebrew that I couldn't understand but knew represented fear and pain. And for the first time, I saw people die. Not in videos or photographs, but in real life, in real time, as a direct result of actions I was helping to coordinate. I watched soldiers, young men probably not much older than myself, fall to the ground and stop moving, their lives ending in an instant of violence. I expected to feel triumph, satisfaction, holy joy at seeing the enemies of Islam receive their just punishment. Instead, I felt something much more complicated. A mixture of excitement, revulsion, pride, and unexpected sadness that I couldn't have explained to anyone. But I pushed those confused feelings down and focused on what I knew I was supposed to feel. Gratitude to Allah for allowing me to participate in jihad, satisfaction at striking a blow against the oppressors, determination to do more and better in future operations. The mission was considered a success. 3 Israeli soldiers were killed, 2 others wounded, and our entire team escaped without casualties. In the celebration that followed, I was praised for my discipline and courage, welcomed as a full member of the fighting unit, and promised more significant responsibilities in future operations. I was 17 years old, and I had helped kill 3 human beings in the name of God. Over the next 5 years, I participated in dozens of operations of varying scale and complexity. Some were simple harassment actions, setting roadside bombs, firing mortars at settlements, conducting hit-and-run attacks on military patrols. Others were more elaborate affairs involving multiple cells, sophisticated planning, and significant casualties on both sides. With each operation, I became more skilled, more trusted, and more committed to the cause. I learned to suppress any doubts or humanitarian impulses that might interfere with my effectiveness as a fighter. I developed a reputation for reliability, courage, and absolute dedication to the jihad against Israel. But I also began to develop a growing emptiness that I couldn't quite identify or explain. The more violence I participated in, the less satisfying it became. The more enemies I helped kill, the more enemies seemed to appear. The more sacrifices we made for the cause, the further away victory seemed to get. I began having dreams about the people who had died in operations I had supported. Not nightmares exactly. I wasn't tormented by guilt over their deaths, which I still believed were justified. But I found myself wondering about their families, their hopes, their fears in the moments before they died. I also began noticing inconsistencies in the behavior of some of our leaders. They spoke constantly about the glory of martyrdom and the duty to sacrifice everything for Allah's cause, but they seemed remarkably reluctant to martyr themselves. They lived in comfortable houses while sending young men like me to die in dangerous operations. They spoke about religious purity while engaging in activities that seemed to contradict Islamic ethics. But these doubts were dangerous, and I learned to suppress them. Questioning the leadership was tantamount to questioning the cause itself, and questioning the cause was tantamount to questioning Allah. I had been taught that doubt was a tool of Satan, designed to weaken the resolve of righteous fighters. So I continued fighting, continued killing, continued believing that I was serving the highest possible purpose, even as a part of me grew increasingly hollow and confused. The operation that would change everything began planning in September 2017. It was supposed to be our most ambitious action yet. A coordinated attack on multiple Israeli positions designed to inflict maximum casualties and demonstrate our growing capabilities. I had been selected to lead one of the assault teams, a recognition of the trust I had earned through years of faithful service. At 22, I was one of the youngest unit commanders in our organization, responsible for planning the tactical details of the operation and leading 12 other fighters into battle. We spent weeks preparing, studying satellite photos of the target, rehearsing assault techniques, coordinating timing with other units, preparing weapons and equipment. Every detail was planned and rehearsed until we could execute the operation in our sleep. But as the launch date approached, I found myself experiencing something I had never felt before. Genuine uncertainty about what we were doing. What would we actually accomplish by killing the soldiers at this outpost? How would their deaths advance the cause of Palestinian liberation? Would this operation bring us any closer to victory? Or would it simply provoke more retaliation that would harm innocent Palestinian civilians? I tried to push these doubts away, but they persisted and grew stronger. For the first time in years, I found myself thinking seriously about the individuals we were planning to kill. Young men with families and dreams, people who had never personally harmed me or my loved ones, human beings whose deaths would cause the same kind of grief I had experienced when my father died. But it was too late for second thoughts. The operation was scheduled. My men were ready, and backing down would be seen as cowardice or betrayal. On the night of October 23, 2017, I led my team across the border toward our target, carrying weapons, explosives, and the absolute conviction that we were about to perform a sacred act of worship through violence. I had no idea that I was walking into the experience that would shatter everything I believed about God, faith, and the meaning of my life. The operation that was supposed to be my crowning achievement as a jihadi fighter became the moment when Allah, or perhaps God, as I would later understand, began tearing down the walls of hatred I had built around my heart. Our approach to the Israeli outpost went exactly according to plan. We moved through the darkness with practiced silence. 12 men armed with automatic weapons, grenades, and enough explosives to level the small concrete structure that housed our targets. Intelligence had told us to expect 4 to 6 soldiers on duty, lightly armed and unprepared for a coordinated assault. What intelligence hadn't told us was that this particular night had been chosen for a training exercise involving special forces units from multiple bases. Instead of 4 sleepy guards, we were walking into a facility temporarily housing nearly 40 of Israel's most elite combat soldiers. The first sign that something was wrong came when our point man reported seeing far more lights in the compound than our reconnaissance had indicated. Through our night vision equipment, we could see unusual activity, vehicles that shouldn't have been there, movement patterns that suggested a much larger garrison than expected. I should have aborted the mission then. But I was 22 years old, pumped full of adrenaline and religious fervor, and convinced that Allah would protect those who served His cause with courage and faith. I whispered into my radio that we would proceed as planned, that Allah was with us. Those words would haunt me for months afterward. We began our assault at 3:17 a.m. The initial explosion went off perfectly. Everything was proceeding according to plan for exactly 47 seconds. Then the entire world exploded into light and noise as floodlights illuminated our position and automatic weapons began firing from positions we hadn't known existed. We had walked into a carefully prepared trap. The next few minutes were chaos beyond anything I had experienced in 5 years of warfare. My men scattered, seeking cover, returning fire as best they could. But we were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely exposed in terrain the enemy knew far better than we did. I watched 3 of my fighters die in the first 2 minutes of combat. Not the clean, glorious deaths we had been promised, not martyrdom that would guarantee paradise, but ugly, painful endings that left them writhing in the dirt, calling for their mothers as their lives drained away. I screamed for everyone to fall back, but there was no falling back. The Israelis had anticipated our escape routes and positioned forces to cut us off. What had been planned as a quick strike was turning into a siege, with us trapped in a killing field with no way out. Mahmoud, one of my oldest friends and most trusted fighters, took a sniper's bullet to the chest while trying to reach better cover. I crawled to him through rifle fire, dragging him behind a low concrete wall where he bled out in my arms. As he died, he asked if we had gotten them, if we had struck a blow for Allah. I looked around at the chaos, at my dead and dying men, at the overwhelming enemy fire, at the complete failure of everything we had planned, and realized that we hadn't struck any kind of blow for anyone. But I told him yes, that we had done Allah's work, because what else could I say to a dying friend? The firefight lasted another 20 minutes before my ammunition ran low and my options ran out. Of the 12 men I had led across the border, 7 were dead, 3 were wounded, and 2 had been captured already. I was alone behind a pile of rubble, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, facing the choice between surrender and suicide. In that moment, everything I had been taught about martyrdom and paradise seemed very abstract and distant. What felt real was my mother's face, my sister's laughter, the possibility of never seeing them again. What felt real was the fear of dying alone in the dirt, 22 years old, having accomplished nothing but adding to the world's total of pain and death. I threw down my weapon and raised my hands, shouting in Arabic that I wasn't fighting anymore, that I was wounded. The shooting stopped, and after what felt like an eternity, I heard boots approaching my position. A voice called out in accented Arabic, telling me to stand up slowly and keep my hands visible. I struggled to my feet and found myself facing 4 Israeli soldiers with their weapons trained on me. They were young, probably around my age, and I could see adrenaline and fear in their eyes. They had expected to die tonight too. The soldier who seemed to be in charge gestured for me to turn around and place my hands behind my back, but his voice wasn't cruel or threatening. He told me I was wounded and that they would get me medical attention. It was such a simple statement, but it hit me like a physical blow. This enemy soldier, this representative of the people I had been trying to kill, was promising to provide medical care for my injuries. He was treating me like a human being deserving of compassion rather than an animal to be destroyed. The medic who treated my wounds while I sat zip-tied in the back of an armored vehicle was professional and gentle. He cleaned my cuts, bandaged my shrapnel wounds, and even gave me water when I asked for it. When he asked my name, the question surprised me. In all my years of training and fighting, no one had ever suggested that the enemy would want to know my name, would care about me as an individual rather than just a target. When I told him my name was Omar, he said his was David, and that he was sorry I was hurt. Sorry about that night. He was sorry. This Israeli medic was sorry that I was hurt. Sorry that my friends were dead. Sorry that any of this had happened. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and it created a crack in my understanding of the world that would eventually split wide open. The first few days of my captivity were a blur of interrogations, medical examinations, and psychological evaluation. I was treated according to international law, fed regularly, given clean clothes, allowed to sleep, not tortured or abused. The interrogators were professional, even respectful, despite the fact that I had just tried to kill their colleagues. But perhaps the most unsettling thing was how normal they all seemed. These weren't the monsters I had been taught to hate. They were just people doing their jobs. People with families and concerns and hopes. People who seemed to take no pleasure in my capture or the deaths of my men. Major Cohen, the intelligence officer who conducted most of my interrogations, was particularly puzzling. He was patient, methodical, and seemed genuinely interested in understanding my background and motivations, rather than just extracting tactical information. During our sessions, he would ask why I had become a fighter. I would fall back on the simple narrative that had driven me, that they had killed my father. He would express sorrow for my loss, but point out that he hadn't killed my father, that the men in this facility hadn't killed my father, that most of them weren't even in the military when my father died. So why had I come there to kill them? It was a reasonable question, but it challenged the entire framework of collective guilt and inherited conflict that I had been raised to believe. When I said they were all the same, he asked if all Palestinians were the same, if I was responsible for every attack launched by every Palestinian group, if they should blame me for actions taken by people I'd never met. I had no good answer for that question, so I retreated into silence. But the questions kept coming, day after day, not just from Major Cohen, but from the entire experience of being treated humanely by people I had expected to be devils. The prison where I was eventually transferred was nothing like what I had expected. It was clean, organized, and run according to strict rules that seemed designed to preserve dignity even in captivity. I had my own cell, regular meals, access to books, and scheduled time for exercise and personal care. More importantly, I had time to think. For the first time in years, I wasn't constantly training, planning operations, or surrounded by propaganda reinforcing my militant beliefs. I was alone with my thoughts, my memories, and my growing confusion about everything I had believed. The questioning started small, like drops of water on stone. Had my father's death really been necessary? Had the operation that killed him actually accomplished anything meaningful, or had it just provoked more retaliation? Were the Israelis I had met really the evil oppressors I had been taught to hate? But larger questions followed. If Allah truly supported our cause, why did we keep losing? If jihad was truly blessed by divine favor, why did it produce so much suffering for Palestinians and Israelis alike? If our enemies were truly as evil as we claimed, why were they treating me with such humanity? I tried to pray the way I had been taught, 5 times a day, facing Mecca, reciting the verses that had shaped my worldview for so long. But the prayers felt increasingly empty, like words spoken into a void with no one listening. The prison chaplain, a Muslim imam who served the spiritual needs of Palestinian prisoners, noticed my growing spiritual distress during our weekly meetings. When he asked if I was struggling with doubt, I admitted that I didn't understand why Allah had let this happen, why He had let me be captured when I had served Him faithfully and been prepared to die for the faith. Imam Yusuf gave the traditional answer about Allah's mysterious ways and suffering being a test of faith that would be rewarded in the afterlife. But his words no longer carried the comfort they once had. If Allah's ways were so mysterious that they appeared indistinguishable from random chance, if His justice was so abstract that it could only be experienced after death, then what practical difference did faith make in the real world? I began asking different questions. Why did religious faith seem to produce so much violence? Why did different groups of believers, all claiming to serve the same God, spend so much time killing each other? Why did the most devout Muslims I knew seem to be the angriest, most hate-filled people? These weren't questions I could discuss with Imam Yusuf or with other Palestinian prisoners who would have seen them as dangerous apostasy. So I wrestled with them alone, night after night, as my certainty about everything I had believed continued to crumble. The first major crack in my worldview came 6 months into my imprisonment. I was in the prison library, reading a history book about the Middle East, when I came across a detailed account of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. But this wasn't the version I had learned growing up, where innocent Palestinians were driven from their homes by Jewish terrorists and Western imperialists. This account included perspectives from all sides, Arab, Jewish, and international observers. It described mistakes and atrocities committed by both sides. It acknowledged the legitimate grievances and fears of both peoples. It presented the conflict as a tragic collision between 2 justified national movements, rather than a simple story of good versus evil. I read that account 3 times, trying to reconcile it with everything I had been taught. Slowly, I began to realize that the narrative I had grown up with, while containing elements of truth, was incomplete, one-sided, designed more to justify hatred and violence than to promote understanding or peace. If I had been wrong about the fundamental nature of our conflict, what else had I been wrong about? That question led me to read more widely than I ever had before. The prison library contained books on history, philosophy, religion, and politics from many different perspectives. For the first time in my life, I was exposed to ideas that challenged rather than confirmed my existing beliefs. I read about other conflicts around the world and saw how each side always believed it was fighting a holy war against evil enemies. I read about the history of Christianity and Islam and discovered how both faiths had been used to justify violence and oppression. I read about peace movements and religious leaders who had chosen reconciliation over revenge. Slowly, very slowly, I began to understand that the world was far more complex and ambiguous than I had been taught. Good and evil existed, but they ran through individual hearts rather than dividing neatly along religious or national lines. Every conflict had multiple perspectives. Every narrative had blind spots. Every cause, no matter how just, could be corrupted by hatred and extremism. But understanding intellectual complexity was different from finding spiritual peace. If anything, my growing awareness of the world's moral ambiguity left me feeling more lost than ever. If my previous beliefs were wrong, what should I believe instead? If my previous purpose was misguided, what should I live for? I began having what I can only describe as a spiritual crisis. The God I had worshipped seemed distant and silent. The faith I had lived for seemed hollow and destructive. The purpose that had driven me seemed pointless and cruel. For the first time since childhood, I found myself questioning whether God existed at all. Maybe religion was just a human invention designed to justify whatever people wanted to do anyway. Maybe there was no divine plan, no ultimate justice, no meaning beyond what we created for ourselves. These dark thoughts consumed me for months. I stopped attending prayers, stopped meeting with the imam, stopped reading religious texts. I ate, slept, exercised, and read secular books, but I felt spiritually dead inside. It was during this period of spiritual emptiness that something unexpected happened. I was assigned a new cellmate, a Palestinian man named Rashid, who had been imprisoned for several years and had a reputation as a troublemaker among both guards and other prisoners. But Rashid was different from what I expected. He was calm, peaceful, even joyful despite his circumstances. He treated everyone with kindness, shared what little he had freely, and seemed to possess an inner strength that was obvious to everyone around him. After we had been cellmates for several weeks, I asked him what his secret was. He smiled, a genuine expression of happiness that seemed impossible in our circumstances, and said there was no secret, just grace. When I asked what he meant, he explained it as the undeserved love of God, shown to us through Jesus Christ. I stared at him in shock. He was Christian, but he was Palestinian. He was Arab. He was everything I thought made Christianity impossible. He simply said he was a human being loved by God just like I was. He had become a follower of Jesus 3 years earlier, there in that prison. That conversation changed everything. For the first time since my capture, I had met someone who seemed to have found genuine peace, not the angry certainty of the militant, not the resigned fatalism of the traditionalist, but actual peace that radiated from the inside out. And he was a Christian, a Palestinian Christian, which I had been taught was almost a contradiction in terms. I found myself asking him to tell me about this Jesus. Rashid smiled again and said he thought I'd never ask. The conversation with Rashid about Jesus opened something in my heart that I didn't even know was closed. For months, I had been intellectually questioning my beliefs, but this was different. This was the first time since my capture that I felt genuine curiosity about spiritual matters rather than just confusion and anger. Rashid didn't try to pressure me or overwhelm me with religious arguments. Instead, he simply lived differently than anyone I had ever known. In a place designed to break men's spirits, he radiated peace. In circumstances that would justify bitterness and despair, he showed kindness and hope. In an environment where everyone looked out only for themselves, he consistently put others first. I watched him for weeks before we had our first real conversation about faith. I saw him give away his extra food to weaker prisoners. I watched him comfort men who were having nightmares. I observed how he treated the guards with respect, even when they were harsh with him. There was something in his behavior that was completely foreign to my experience, but utterly attractive. It wasn't just that he was good. I had known good Muslims, good men who tried to follow Islamic teachings about charity and kindness. But Rashid's goodness seemed to flow from a different source. It wasn't based on earning rewards or avoiding punishment. It wasn't motivated by community expectations or religious obligations. It seemed to come from some deep well of joy and peace that I couldn't understand. When I finally asked him directly about his faith, he began telling me about Jesus in ways I had never heard before. Growing up in Gaza, I had learned about Jesus, or Isa, as we called him in Arabic, as one of the prophets of Islam. We respected him as a righteous man sent by Allah, but we believed that Christians had corrupted his message and wrongly claimed he was the Son of God. But Rashid spoke about Jesus differently. He talked about a man who had come to earth not as a conqueror or political leader, but as a servant. He described someone who had spent his time with society's outcasts, tax collectors, prostitutes, lepers, foreigners, rather than with the religious and political elite. He told me about teachings that emphasized love for enemies, forgiveness for those who wronged you, and care for the poor and marginalized. Most shocking of all, he told me that Jesus had willingly died for his enemies, praying for their forgiveness even as they crucified him. This was nothing like the Jesus I had been taught about. In the Islamic version of the story, Jesus was a great prophet who would return at the end of times to fight alongside Muslims against their enemies. But Rashid's Jesus seemed to be offering something else entirely, not victory over enemies, but transformation of enemies into friends. I was skeptical, of course. Years of anti-Christian propaganda had taught me that Christianity was the religion of crusaders and colonizers, people who used faith to justify oppression and violence. I pointed this out to Rashid, mentioning the Crusades, the colonial exploitation of Muslim countries, and the Christian support for Israel that I had been taught to hate. Rashid didn't deny that terrible things had been done in the name of Christianity. Instead, he acknowledged them honestly and said that whenever people used religion to justify hatred and violence, they were betraying the very foundation of their faith. He pointed out that terrible things had also been done in the name of Islam, including many of the things I had participated in myself. But then he said something that stayed with me for weeks. "Omar, you can't judge Jesus by the failures of people who claim to follow him. You have to judge him by his own words and actions. And when you look at what Jesus actually said and did, it's impossible to use his teachings to justify hatred or violence against anyone." This intrigued me enough to ask more questions. What had Jesus actually said? How did his teachings differ from what I had been taught about Christianity? Why did Rashid believe that Jesus was more than just another prophet? Rashid's answers came not in long theological lectures, but in daily conversations as we shared our small cell. He would tell me stories from the Gospels about Jesus healing the sick, teaching in parables, confronting religious hypocrisy, showing compassion to everyone he met. But he always connected these stories to their meaning for daily life, showing how Jesus' teachings could transform the way people thought about themselves, their enemies, and their purpose in the world. One story that particularly affected me was the account of Jesus' crucifixion. I had always believed that God would never allow a righteous prophet to die in such a humiliating way, that the crucifixion was either a lie invented by Christians or a punishment that proved Jesus wasn't really from God. But Rashid explained it differently. He said that Jesus had chosen to die, that his death wasn't a sign of weakness or failure, but the ultimate demonstration of God's love. Instead of destroying his enemies, God had allowed himself to be destroyed by them. Instead of conquering through power, he had conquered through sacrifice. Instead of demanding that humans earn his forgiveness, he had paid the price for their wrongdoing himself. I struggled to understand this concept. Everything in my background had taught me that God's power was demonstrated through the victory of his followers over their enemies. The idea of a God who would choose to suffer and die for people who hated him was completely foreign to everything I had been taught about divine justice and power. But as Rashid continued sharing these stories, I found myself drawn to this different vision of God. Instead of a deity who demanded that I earn his favor through violence and sacrifice, Jesus seemed to be revealing a God who loved unconditionally, who forgave freely, who wanted relationship rather than religious performance. It was during one of these conversations that something unexpected happened. A group of Christian volunteers arrived at the prison for one of their monthly visits. I had heard about these people. They came from various churches around Israel to minister to Palestinian prisoners. But I had never paid much attention to them before. Most of the Palestinian inmates either ignored them completely or treated them with barely concealed hostility. But Rashid was excited about their visit. He told me that these were the people who had first told him about Jesus, who had helped him understand the gospel, who continued to encourage him in his faith. He asked if I would be willing to meet with them. My first instinct was to refuse. These were Israelis, probably supporters of the occupation, people who represented everything I had been fighting against. But my curiosity about Jesus was stronger than my political hostility, so I agreed to attend one of their meetings. The group was led by Father Michael, a Catholic priest in his 60s, and Sister Ruth, a Protestant missionary who had been working in Israel and Palestine for over 20 years. There were also several lay people, teachers, business people, retirees, who gave up their free time to visit prisoners. What struck me immediately was how different they were from what I expected. They weren't triumphant or condescending. They didn't seem to be trying to score political points or convert people for the sake of religious statistics. They were simply kind, genuinely, obviously kind in a way that seemed to flow from something deeper than mere politeness. Father Michael spoke Arabic fluently, with a slight Palestinian accent that he had picked up during decades of ministry in the region. When he introduced himself to me, he didn't ask about my crimes or try to lecture me about politics. Instead, he asked about my family, my health, whether there was anything he could pray for on my behalf. Sister Ruth was equally gentle. She had brought Arabic Bibles to give away, but she didn't pressure anyone to take them. She simply made them available and spent most of her time listening to prisoners talk about their concerns, their fears, their hopes for the future. During that first meeting, I mostly listened. Other prisoners asked questions about Christianity, some hostile, others genuinely curious. The volunteers answered everything with patience and respect, never becoming defensive, even when challenged aggressively. But what impressed me most was what happened when one prisoner, a man named Khalil, who had been imprisoned for over a decade, broke down crying while talking about his children. He hadn't seen his daughter since she was 5 years old. She was now 16 and didn't even remember him. He felt like he had wasted his entire life, that he had nothing to offer his family, even if he was ever released. Father Michael didn't offer empty platitudes or quick solutions. Instead, he sat with Khalil in his pain, acknowledging the reality of his loss, while gently suggesting that God's love was bigger than any mistake, that redemption was possible even in the most hopeless circumstances. And then something remarkable happened. The priest began to cry too. Not out of pity or professional sympathy, but out of genuine grief for this broken man's suffering. In that moment, I saw something I had never seen before. An Israeli Jewish Christian weeping over the pain of a Palestinian Muslim prisoner, caring about his suffering as if it were his own. That image stayed with me for days afterward. I kept trying to fit it into my understanding of the world, but it wouldn't fit. According to everything I had been taught, this man should have been my enemy. He represented the religious and ethnic groups that I had been raised to hate. But his tears for Khalil's pain seemed completely genuine, motivated by nothing but pure compassion. After that meeting, I found myself thinking more and more about what I had seen and heard. The volunteers returned the following month, and this time I participated more actively in the discussions. I asked questions about Jesus' teachings, about Christian beliefs, about how their faith affected their daily lives. Father Michael gave me my first Bible during that second meeting. It was in Arabic, translated in a way that made it accessible to someone from my background. He didn't pressure me to read it or make any commitments. He simply said that if I was curious about Jesus, the best way to learn about him was to read his own words in the Gospels. I took the Bible back to my cell, but didn't open it for several days. Part of me was curious, but another part was afraid. I had been taught that the Bible was corrupted, that Christians had changed the original message to suit their purposes. What if reading it led me further away from the truth, rather than closer to it? But finally, late one night, when I couldn't sleep, I opened the book to the Gospel of Matthew and began reading about Jesus' birth and childhood. The stories were familiar from the Quranic accounts I had learned growing up, but there were also details and perspectives I had never heard before. As I continued reading, I encountered the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' most famous collection of teachings. And there, in black and white, I found words that challenged everything I had ever believed about God, faith, and how we should treat our enemies. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. I read these words over and over, trying to understand what they meant. This wasn't the message of any religion I had ever encountered. Every faith tradition I knew about had some version of love your friends and fight your enemies. But Jesus seemed to be teaching something completely different, something that turned the normal understanding of justice and righteousness upside down. The more I read, the more confused and intrigued I became. Jesus wasn't calling people to holy war against their enemies. He wasn't promising political victory or material rewards for faithful service. Instead, he was offering spiritual transformation, a complete change of heart that would make it possible to love those who had wronged you, to forgive those who had hurt you, to serve others rather than demanding that they serve you. But the passage that affected me most deeply was Jesus' prayer from the cross. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Here was a man being tortured to death by his enemies, and his response wasn't to curse them or call down divine judgment upon them. Instead, he was asking God to forgive them, making excuses for their behavior, treating them with mercy, even as they showed him none. I thought about my own enemies, the Israeli soldiers who had killed my father, the guards who had captured me, the people I had spent years trying to kill. Could I ever pray for God to forgive them? Could I ever see them as fellow human beings deserving of mercy rather than objects of righteous vengeance? The honest answer was no. I couldn't imagine having that kind of love for my enemies, but for the first time in my life, I found myself wishing that I could. Over the following weeks, I continued reading the Gospels and discussing what I found with Rashid. He helped me understand passages that confused me, explained the cultural context of Jesus' teachings, and shared how these truths had transformed his own heart and mind. Slowly, I began to see that Christianity, at least the version that Jesus actually taught, wasn't about political power or ethnic superiority or religious privilege. It was about a God who loved all people equally, who wanted to heal the divisions that separated human beings from each other, who offered forgiveness and new life to anyone who was willing to receive them. But understanding something intellectually was different from accepting it personally. I could see the beauty and power of Jesus' teachings, but I wasn't ready to abandon everything I had believed and embraced an entirely different faith. The change happening in my heart was slow and gradual, like ice melting in the spring sun. The breakthrough came during the volunteers' third visit to our prison. Sister Ruth was leading a discussion about Jesus' parable of the prodigal son, the story of a young man who had wasted his inheritance, disgraced his family, and ended up feeding pigs before finally deciding to return home and ask for forgiveness. As she told the story, I saw myself in that wayward son. I had wasted the life God had given me, caused tremendous pain to others, made choices that had led to death and suffering. Like the prodigal, I was far from home, spiritually and emotionally bankrupt, with nothing to offer but my failures and regrets. But the most powerful part of the story was the father's response when his son returned. Instead of anger or disappointment, there was immediate forgiveness and celebration. Instead of punishment, there was restoration. Instead of rejection, there was unconditional love. Could God really love me like that father loved his prodigal son? Could someone who had committed the acts I had committed, who had harbored the hatred I had harbored, really be forgiven and accepted by a holy God? Sister Ruth seemed to read my thoughts. She looked directly at me and said something I will never forget. "Omar, no matter what you have done, no matter how far you have wandered from God, His love for you has never changed. He is waiting for you to come home." That night, alone in my cell, I fell to my knees and wept for the first time since my father's funeral. But these weren't tears of anger or frustration. They were tears of recognition of how lost I had been, how much pain I had caused, how desperately I needed the forgiveness that Jesus was offering. And for the first time in my adult life, I prayed to a God I believed was actually listening. The prayer I offered that night in my prison cell was nothing like the formal prayers I had recited 5 times daily for most of my life. There were no specific words, no prescribed postures, no religious formulas. It was simply the cry of a broken heart seeking healing, a lost soul asking for direction, a guilty man desperate for forgiveness. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I remember the feeling, a mixture of shame, hope, fear, and longing that seemed to pour out of me like water from a broken dam. I confessed my sins, not just the acts of violence I had committed, but the hatred I had carried, the lies I had believed, the years I had spent serving darkness while believing I was serving light. And then, in the quiet of that small cell, I experienced something I had never felt before: peace. Not the absence of problems or the promise of easy solutions, but a deep, settled assurance that I was no longer alone, that someone greater than myself was listening, that forgiveness was possible even for someone like me. I didn't become a different person overnight. The transformation that began that night would take months to unfold, and in many ways it continues even today. But something fundamental changed in that moment. Something in the core of my being that affected everything else about how I saw myself, other people, and the world around me. The most immediate change was in how I read the Bible. What had started as intellectual curiosity became spiritual hunger. I found myself reading not just to understand what Jesus had taught, but to discover what it meant for my own life. The words that had once seemed foreign and challenging began to feel like personal messages from God Himself. I was particularly drawn to Jesus' interactions with people who had been rejected by society, tax collectors who had betrayed their own people, women caught in adultery, thieves hanging on crosses beside Him. In every case, Jesus offered hope and redemption to people who had made terrible choices, who had hurt others, who seemed beyond help. But He didn't just forgive them, He transformed them. The tax collector became honest. The woman caught in adultery was told to sin no more. The thief on the cross was promised paradise. Jesus didn't just overlook their sins, He gave them the power to become new people. I began to believe that the same transformation was possible for me. Rashid noticed the change in me immediately. He said that I seemed different, lighter somehow, as if a burden I had been carrying for years had finally been lifted. When I told him about my prayer and the peace I had experienced, he wept with joy and said he had been praying for months that God would open my heart to the gospel. But the most significant confirmation of what was happening to me came during the volunteers' next visit. When Father Michael asked how I was doing, I found myself telling him about my spiritual struggles, my growing understanding of Jesus' message, and my desire to follow Him. The old priest listened with tears in his eyes. When I finished speaking, he said something that completed the transformation that had begun in my heart. "Omar, would you like to give your life to Jesus Christ? Would you like to be baptized and officially become His follower?" The question should have terrified me. Becoming a Christian meant abandoning not just my previous religious beliefs, but my entire identity as a Palestinian Muslim fighter. It meant accepting that everything I had lived for was wrong, that the people I had tried to kill were actually my brothers and sisters in God's family, that my calling was to love and serve rather than to hate and destroy. But instead of fear, I felt overwhelming joy. Yes, I wanted to give my life to Jesus. Yes, I wanted to be baptized. Yes, I wanted to officially become a Christian. The baptism took place 2 weeks later, on December 18, 2018. It had to be done quietly, both for my safety and to avoid creating problems for the prison administration. Father Michael, Sister Ruth, and Rashid were the only witnesses as I was immersed in a large basin of water that the volunteers had been allowed to bring for the ceremony. As I came up out of that water, I felt like a completely new person. The old Omar, the fighter, the hater, the man driven by vengeance and religious extremism, seemed to have drowned in those depths. The person who emerged was still learning who he was supposed to be, but he knew that his life now belonged to Jesus Christ. The change in my daily routine was immediate and obvious. Instead of the ritual prayers of Islam, I now spent time each morning reading the Bible and talking with God in the personal, conversational way that Jesus had taught his followers to pray. Instead of focusing on my rights, my grievances, and my enemies, I began thinking about how I could serve others and show them the love that God had shown me. This transformation didn't go unnoticed by other prisoners. Some were curious and asked questions about what had happened to me. Others were hostile, seeing my conversion as a betrayal of Palestinian identity and Islamic faith. A few even threatened violence, saying that apostates deserved to die according to Islamic law. But I found that I wasn't afraid of their threats, not because I was particularly brave, but because I had discovered something worth more than my physical safety, a relationship with God that gave meaning to suffering and hope beyond death. If my faith cost me my life, I was prepared to pay that price. More surprising to me was how my attitude toward my captors had changed. The Israeli guards, interrogators, and prison officials who had once been objects of hatred now seemed like people for whom Jesus had died. I began praying for them, asking God to bless them and their families, hoping that they too might discover the peace and purpose that came from knowing Christ. This change in attitude was so dramatic that Major Cohen, the intelligence officer who had interrogated me after my capture, asked to meet with me again. He said he had noticed reports of my behavioral change and wanted to understand what had happened. When I told him about my conversion to Christianity, he was silent for a long time. Finally, he said something that I will never forget. "Omar, if what you're telling me is true, if you really have discovered a faith that can transform hatred into love, then you may have found something more powerful than any weapon we have in this conflict." But the real test of my transformation came when I learned that I might be eligible for early release. An international prisoner exchange was being negotiated, and my name was on the preliminary list of Palestinians who might be freed as part of the agreement. My first reaction was joy. After nearly 3 years in prison, the possibility of freedom seemed like a dream come true. But as I thought more about it, I realized that release would force me to confront some difficult questions. Where would I go? What would I do? How would I live as a Palestinian Christian in a world that would see that identity as a contradiction? I couldn't return to Gaza. My conversion to Christianity would be seen as apostasy, punishable by death according to the interpretation of Islamic law that prevailed in my community. My former comrades would view me as a traitor who had been brainwashed by the enemy. My family would be shamed by my abandonment of Islam, and they might even feel obligated to disown me, or worse. But I also couldn't simply disappear and start a new life somewhere else. God had given me a story of transformation that could help others find the same peace and purpose I had discovered. He had taken my years of hatred and violence and turned them into a testimony of his redeeming love. Somehow I needed to find a way to share that testimony with the world. The answer came through the same Christian volunteers who had introduced me to Jesus. Father Michael and Sister Ruth had connections with international Christian organizations that helped refugees and asylum seekers. They believed that my story could be powerful in promoting peace and reconciliation between Palestinians and Israelis, Muslims and Christians, anyone trapped in cycles of hatred and violence. They began working with their contacts to identify countries where I might be able to seek asylum, organizations that could sponsor my resettlement, and ministries that could help me develop my testimony into a tool for evangelism and peacemaking. But first, I had to make it through the prisoner exchange and the dangerous transition from captivity to freedom. The release date was set for June 15, 2020. As that day approached, I found myself experiencing a mixture of excitement, anxiety, and profound gratitude. I was excited about the possibility of freedom, anxious about the challenges I would face, and deeply grateful for the journey that had brought me to this point. The night before my release, Rashid and I stayed up late talking about our hopes for the future. He still had several years left on his sentence, but he was optimistic that God would use his remaining time in prison to reach other Palestinian prisoners with the gospel. He made me promise that I would continue sharing my testimony once I was free, that I wouldn't let fear or convenience keep me from telling others about Jesus' power to transform lives. "Omar," he said as we prepared for what we both knew might be our last conversation, "God didn't save you just so you could have a better life. He saved you so you could help save others. Don't forget that. Don't ever forget that." I promised him that I wouldn't forget, that I would spend the rest of my life sharing the story of how God's love had reached into the darkness of my hatred and transformed me into someone who could love his enemies. That promise would soon be tested in ways I couldn't have imagined. The morning of June 15, 2020, I walked out of prison as a completely different person than the one who had been carried in nearly 3 years earlier. Physically, I looked much the same, perhaps thinner, with more gray in my hair than someone my age should have, but spiritually, emotionally, and mentally, I was utterly transformed. The prisoner exchange took place at a border crossing between Israel and Gaza, with representatives from various international organizations serving as witnesses and facilitators. As I stood in line with 17 other Palestinian prisoners being released, I found myself praying for everyone involved. The Israeli officials who were letting us go, the Palestinian representatives who had negotiated our freedom, even the families of victims who might be watching this exchange with mixed feelings. That prayer would have been impossible for the old Omar. The man who had entered prison would have seen this moment as a victory of Palestinian resistance over Israeli oppression. But the man walking out understood it as an act of grace from God, using imperfect human institutions to accomplish his perfect purposes. The most difficult part of the exchange was facing the Palestinian officials who were there to receive us. They expected me to be angry, bitter, ready to return to the fight against occupation. Instead, they found someone who spoke about forgiveness, reconciliation, and the need for peace between our peoples. One official, a man I had known slightly before my imprisonment, pulled me aside and asked what had happened to me in prison. When I told him I had become a Christian, his expression changed from confusion to disgust to fear. "You can't go back to Gaza," he said quietly. "Not as a Christian. There are people there who would kill you for apostasy, and I couldn't protect you even if I wanted to." I had expected this response, but it still hurt to hear it confirmed. I was free from prison, but I couldn't return home. I was a Palestinian who couldn't live in Palestine, a Muslim-born man who could no longer be Muslim, a former fighter who now preached peace. I belonged nowhere and fit into no existing category. But Father Michael and Sister Ruth had prepared for this situation. They were waiting at the crossing with representatives from an international Christian aid organization that had agreed to help me seek asylum in a European country. Within hours of my release from prison, I was on a plane to a refugee processing center in Cyprus, beginning another phase of my journey. The refugee camp was unlike anything I had expected. Instead of the desperate, hopeless place I had imagined, I found a community of people from around the world who had all been forced to leave their homelands for various reasons. There were Syrians fleeing civil war, Iraqis escaping sectarian violence, Afghans running from Taliban persecution, and many others whose stories of loss and displacement made mine seem almost ordinary. But what struck me most was the presence of Christians among the refugees. I had expected to be the only Palestinian Christian in the camp, probably the only Christian convert from Islam. Instead, I found dozens of believers who had paid tremendous prices for their faith. People who had been beaten, imprisoned, threatened, and exiled because they had chosen to follow Jesus. Living among these believers was like getting a crash course in what it meant to be part of the global Christian community. I learned that following Jesus wasn't just a personal decision, but entry into a worldwide family that transcended every earthly division of race, nationality, and social class. I also learned that my story wasn't unique. Person after person told me about their journey from Islam to Christianity, from Buddhism to Christ, from atheism to faith. Each story was different in its details, but all shared the same essential elements: recognition of spiritual emptiness, encounter with Jesus through scripture or Christian witnesses, and transformation that led to new life and purpose. One person who particularly influenced me during this time was Sarah, a Syrian woman whose husband had been killed by Islamic extremists because he had converted from Islam to Christianity. She could have been bitter, angry, focused on revenge against those who had destroyed her family. Instead, she spent her time in the refugee camp ministering to other displaced people, sharing the love of Christ with anyone who would listen. Omar, she told me during one of our conversations, suffering can either make you bitter or make you better. It can either drive you away from God or draw you closer to Him. The choice is always ours. She helped me understand that my years of hatred and violence, painful as they were to remember, had actually prepared me for ministry in unique ways. I understood the mindset of religious extremists because I had been one. I knew the appeal of holy war because I had lived for it. I could speak to people trapped in hatred because I had been trapped there myself. Most importantly, I could testify with absolute authenticity that change was possible, that God's love was stronger than human hatred, that there was hope even for people who had committed terrible acts in the name of religion. This realization led me to begin speaking publicly about my experiences. At first, it was just informal conversations with other refugees, sharing my story with people who were struggling with their own faith journeys. But word spread about the Palestinian former terrorist who had become a Christian. And soon I was being invited to speak at refugee camp meetings, church services, and interfaith dialogues. Each time I told my story, I saw the same response in people's faces: surprise, skepticism, and then gradually, hope. If God could transform someone like me, Maybe he could work in their situations too. If love could overcome the kind of hatred I had carried, maybe it could heal their broken relationships, their damaged families, their wounded communities. The most powerful response came from other Muslims in the refugee camp. Many were nominal believers who had grown up in Muslim cultures without ever seriously considering what they actually believed about God, religion, and spiritual matters. My story forced them to confront questions they had never asked. Was their faith producing love and peace in their lives? Did their understanding of God make them more compassionate or more judgmental toward others? Were they following a religion that brought them closer to divine truth or further from it? Some became angry and accused me of betraying my culture and heritage. Others became curious and began asking questions about Christianity that they had never felt safe to ask before. A few, like me, eventually decided to give their lives to Jesus Christ. But the most meaningful conversation I had during my time in the refugee camp was with a young Palestinian man named Ahmed, who had fled Gaza after being accused of collaborating with Israeli intelligence. He wasn't guilty of the charges. He had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the accusation alone was enough to make his life in Gaza impossible. Ahmed was bitter, angry, and consumed with hatred for everyone who had forced him to leave his homeland. When he heard that I was also from Gaza, he sought me out, expecting to find a kindred spirit who shared his rage and desire for revenge. Instead, he found someone who had traveled the same road of hatred and discovered that it led nowhere but destruction. We talked for hours about our experiences, our losses, our struggles with anger and bitterness. I shared my story of transformation, but I didn't pressure him to make any immediate decisions. I simply tried to show him through my words and actions that there was an alternative to the hatred that was eating him alive. Gradually, over the course of several weeks, I watched Ahmed's heart begin to soften. He started attending the Christian services I was leading in the camp. He began reading the Bible I had given him. Most importantly, he began to pray. Not the formal prayers of Islam, but the personal, conversational prayers of someone seeking genuine relationship with God. On August 14, 2021, Ahmed gave his life to Jesus Christ. I had the privilege of baptizing him in a makeshift pool we created in one of the camp's common areas, surrounded by dozens of other refugees who had become our extended family. As I lowered Ahmed into the water and raised him up again, I realized that God had given me something more precious than I had ever imagined possible. The opportunity to help someone else find the same freedom and peace that had transformed my own life. But my time in the refugee camp was also preparing me for the next phase of my journey. The aid organization that had sponsored my asylum application had been working with immigration officials in several European countries, looking for a nation willing to accept me as a refugee. The answer came in November 2021. Germany had approved my asylum application and was willing to grant me permanent residency with the possibility of citizenship after several years. Leaving the refugee camp was bittersweet. I was grateful for the opportunity to start a new life in a country known for its religious freedom and opportunities for refugees. But I was also sad to leave the community of believers who had become my family. The people who had supported me through my own spiritual growth and helped me begin my ministry to others. Sarah gave me a gift before I left. A small wooden cross that her martyred husband had carved during their early days as Christians in Syria. She said it would remind me that following Jesus always involved sacrifice, but that the sacrifice was always worth it because of the life and purpose it produced. Germany was overwhelming at first. The language, the culture, the bureaucracy, the simple logistics of starting life in a new country, everything was foreign and challenging. But the Lutheran church that had sponsored my asylum application provided tremendous support, helping me find housing, language classes, job training, and most importantly, a community of believers who welcomed me as a brother in Christ. I spent my first year in Germany focusing on integration, learning German, understanding the culture, finding my place in German society. But I never forgot the promise I had made to Rashid, or the calling I felt to share my testimony with others who needed to hear about God's transforming love. In 2022, I began speaking more formally about my experiences. German churches invited me to share my story during services and special events. Christian conferences asked me to participate in sessions about evangelism, peacemaking, and ministry to refugees. Universities requested my perspective on radicalization, de-radicalization, and the role of religion in conflict and reconciliation. Each speaking engagement taught me something new about how God wanted to use my story. I learned that my testimony was particularly powerful with three groups of people: Muslims who were questioning their faith, Christians who needed to be challenged about their prejudices against Muslims, and young people who were struggling with anger and the appeal of extremist ideologies. But the most significant opportunity came in early 2023, when I was invited to participate in a major international conference on religious extremism and peacemaking. The conference brought together former extremists from various religious backgrounds: Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, who had all experienced transformation and were now working to prevent others from following the same destructive paths they had once traveled. Sitting on panels with former white supremacists, ex-jihadists, recovered cult members, and reformed ethnic nationalists, I realized that extremism was a human problem rather than a specifically religious one. People from every faith tradition and political ideology were capable of being radicalized into hatred and violence, but they were also capable of being transformed by genuine encounters with divine love. This realization led to my current work, which began in earnest in late 2023. I now travel throughout Europe and North America, speaking to churches, universities, community organizations, and government agencies about my journey from hatred to hope. But more than just telling my story, I try to help people understand the deeper spiritual and psychological dynamics that make extremism appealing and transformation possible. My message is simple but revolutionary. God's love is more powerful than human hatred. No matter how far someone has traveled down the road of extremism, no matter how many terrible things they have done, no matter how hardened their heart has become, redemption is possible through Jesus Christ. This isn't just a religious platitude or wishful thinking. It's a truth I have experienced personally and witnessed in the lives of dozens of other people who've been transformed by God's grace. It's the foundation of everything I believe about the possibility of peace in our broken world. But I've also learned that transformation requires more than just a moment of spiritual awakening. It requires ongoing discipleship, community support, accountability, and the hard work of learning to live differently than you've lived before. It requires facing the consequences of your past actions while building a future based on different values and priorities. Most challenging of all, it requires forgiveness, both receiving God's forgiveness for your own sins and extending that forgiveness to others who have wronged you. This has been the hardest part of my own journey, learning to truly forgive the Israeli soldiers who killed my father, the system that I felt had oppressed my people, and even myself for the years I wasted serving hatred instead of love. But forgiveness isn't weakness or denial of injustice. It's the decision to break cycles of revenge and retaliation, to refuse to let past wrongs determine future choices, to trust God to bring justice in His own time and way, while working for reconciliation and peace in the present. Today, as I write this testimony in 2024, I am 29 years old and feel like I have lived several different lifetimes. The boy who grew up in Gaza, the teenager who committed his life to jihad, the young man who planned attacks against Israeli targets, the prisoner who experienced spiritual crisis, and the Christian convert who found new life in Jesus. All of these are part of my story, but none of them alone defines who I am now. Who I am now is simply a follower of Jesus Christ, saved by grace, called to share the hope that I have found with others who are still lost in darkness. I am a Palestinian Christian, a German citizen, a former terrorist turned peacemaker, living proof that God can transform anyone who is willing to surrender their life to Him. My work now focuses on three main areas. First, I continue to travel and speak, sharing my testimony with anyone who will listen, and challenging people to consider what genuine faith looks like in a world torn apart by religious and political hatred. Second, I work with organizations that minister to refugees, immigrants, and asylum seekers, particularly those from Muslim backgrounds who are questioning their faith or considering Christianity. I understand the challenges they face, the costs they must count, and the support they need to make such a radical life change. Third, I'm involved in counter-radicalization efforts, working with governments, NGOs, and religious organizations to develop programs that can reach people who are being drawn toward extremist ideologies. I know what makes such ideologies appealing because I was once appealed to by them, and I know what can counter them because I've experienced that transformation myself. But perhaps my most important work is the simplest, trying to live every day as a faithful witness to the love and grace of Jesus Christ. Whether I'm speaking to thousands of people at a conference or having a one-on-one conversation with someone who is struggling with faith questions, my goal is the same: to demonstrate through my words and actions that God's love is real, that transformation is possible, and that there is hope even in the darkest circumstances. I think often about my father, who died believing he was serving God through violence and hatred. I wish he could see what God has done in my life, how He has taken the same passion and dedication that once fueled my terrorism and redirected it toward peacemaking and reconciliation. I believe my father's love for God was genuine, even though his understanding of God was fatally flawed. I pray that somehow, in God's infinite mercy, my father has found the same peace in death that I have found in life. I think about my mother and sister, who I have not seen since my capture in 2017. They probably believe I am dead, and in some ways they would be right. The Omar they knew no longer exists, but I pray for them regularly, asking God to protect them, provide for them, and somehow reveal Himself to them as He revealed Himself to me. I think about Rashid, still serving his sentence in that Israeli prison, still sharing the love of Christ with other Palestinian prisoners. He was my first Christian mentor, the man who showed me what it looked like to follow Jesus in the most difficult circumstances. I pray that God will reunite us someday, either in this life or the next. I think about the Israeli soldiers I tried to kill, the people I hated for so many years. Some of them are probably still serving in the military, still dealing with the trauma of combat, still trying to protect their families and their country from people like I used to be. I pray for them regularly, asking God to heal their wounds, strengthen their families, and somehow use their experiences for good. Most of all, I think about the next person who will hear my story and realize that if God can transform someone like me, He can transform anyone. Maybe that person is reading this testimony right now, wondering if there really is hope for someone with their past, their struggles, their failures. Let me tell you what I've learned through this incredible journey. God's love is not limited by our mistakes, our background, our ethnicity, or our previous religious beliefs. He doesn't love us because we're good. He loves us because He is good. He doesn't wait for us to clean up our lives before accepting us. He accepts us as we are, and then gives us the power to become who He created us to be. The transformation I've experienced didn't happen because I was particularly worthy or because I earned God's favor through good works. It happened because Jesus Christ died on the cross for my sins and rose from the dead to give me new life. It happened because God's grace is more powerful than human hatred, because His love is stronger than our worst impulses, because His mercy extends even to people like me who had committed terrible acts in the name of religion. If you're reading or listening to this and you recognize something of yourself in my story, the anger, the hatred, the sense that violence is justified by your cause or your faith, please know that there is another way. The path of revenge and retaliation leads only to more pain, more death, more broken families, and shattered communities. But the path of forgiveness and love, while difficult, leads to healing, redemption, and genuine peace. If you're listening to this as someone who has given up on the possibility of peace between different religious communities, different ethnic groups, different nations that have been at war for generations, please don't lose hope. I am living proof that enemies can become brothers, that hatred can be transformed into love, that God can break down walls that seem insurmountable to human effort. If you're listening or reading this as a Christian who has written off Muslims as unreachable or inherently violent, please reconsider. I was as committed to Islamic extremism as anyone could be. Yet God reached me through the faithful witness of believers who refused to see me as an enemy. There are millions of Muslims around the world who are searching for truth, questioning their beliefs, open to hearing about the love of Christ, if only someone will share it with them in love, rather than fear or hatred. And if you're listening to this as a Muslim who has been taught that Christians are crusaders and enemies of Islam, please know that the Christians who led me to Christ were not trying to destroy my culture or dominate my people. They were simply sharing the good news that God loves all people equally, that He has provided a way for everyone to be forgiven and reconciled to Him through Jesus Christ, and that this reconciliation extends to our relationships with each other as well. The world today faces many of the same challenges that shaped my early life: religious extremism, ethnic hatred, political violence, cycles of revenge that seem impossible to break. But I have seen firsthand that these problems, as overwhelming as they appear, are not unsolvable. They can be addressed one heart at a time as people encounter the transforming love of God through Jesus Christ. This is why I continue to share my story, why I spend my time traveling and speaking and writing despite the personal costs and ongoing challenges. Not because I think I can single-handedly solve the world's problems, but because I know that God can use even the most broken vessels to accomplish His purposes. Every person who hears my testimony and decides to give their life to Christ represents a victory over hatred and extremism. Every Muslim who becomes a Christian through hearing about my journey is a bridge built between communities that have been separated by centuries of misunderstanding and conflict. Every young person who chooses love over hatred after hearing what I've experienced is a potential peacemaker for the next generation. My prayer is that this testimony will reach people in places where I cannot travel, in languages I cannot speak, in circumstances I cannot imagine. I pray that it will challenge comfortable Christians to take seriously their calling to love their enemies and share the gospel with people from different backgrounds. I pray that it will give hope to struggling believers who wonder if their faith is strong enough to overcome the hatred and division they see in the world. Most importantly, I pray that it will reach people who are where I was in 2017, lost in darkness, serving hatred, believing that violence is the answer to their problems. If you are one of those people, please know that God sees you, loves you, and has a plan for your life that is better than anything you can imagine. He can take your passion, your dedication, your desire to serve something greater than yourself, and redirect it toward purposes that bring life instead of death, healing instead of harm, hope instead of despair. The choice is yours, just as it was mine in that prison cell in 2018. You can continue down the path of hatred and see where it leads, or you can take the risk of opening your heart to a love that is greater than your anger, a peace that surpasses your understanding, a hope that endures beyond any earthly disappointment. I chose love, and it has made all the difference. It can make all the difference for you too. This is my story, but more importantly, it is God's story of what He can do in any life that is surrendered to Him. Thank you for listening. Thank you for considering what it might mean for your own life. And thank you for joining me in praying for a world where stories like mine become so common that hatred and extremism no longer have the power to divide us. May God bless you, and may He use your life, whatever your background, to bring His love and peace to a world that desperately needs both.